This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. I'm Sally Alsop, the ICG committee member responsible for running our webinar programme. So for today's webinar, we're delighted to welcome Daniel Richardson, Professor of Experimental Psychology at UCL and Chief Scientific Officer at ACN. Daniel's research examines how cognitive processes are grounded in the body, the environment, and the social world. He's the author of Man vs. Mind and Social Psychology for Dummies and has published more than 50 articles in international scientific journals. He's consulted for groups such as the BBC, Audible, Just Giving, Google, and View Cinemas, and performed shows at the London Science Museum and Bloomsbury Theatre, combining science, music, and live experiments on the group mind of the audience. Applied Consumer Neuroscience, or ACN, uses neuroscience to help companies gain insight into the behaviour and experience of their customers. Daniel will be talking to us today about contemporary uses and misuse of neuroscience methods and ideas, and describing some of the different ways that neuroscience can be used for market research and to provide content for marketing campaigns, illustrating this with examples from some of ACN's own work. Daniel said he's happy to take questions as he goes through, if something important comes up, or in a Q&A session at the end of the talk. So if you leave on your webcam and would like to ask a question, please raise your hand or just type your question in the chat box and I'll read it out for you. So before I hand over to Daniel, here are some more webinars and events we've planned for you up until July. Don't forget that we're able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars. Sponsorship normally costs £120 for a lot of exposure on our website, mailers and social media, and of course on the day. Please contact Lucy if you'd like to know more. And so our speaker today is Daniel Richardson of UCL and ACN Labs, and I'll now hand over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, and lovely to be with you all today. Thank you for staying inside when it's so lovely and warm and watching a laptop instead of the sunshine. Let me just switch to my screen 1 second.
Yeah, that looks good. Very clear.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so yeah, thank you for having me this morning, and I'll be talking to you about our work with ACN. And this consultancy group was set up by my friend Joe and I. We're both professors at UCL, and we began it really because if you're an academic, as you go through your career, you get more and more involved, and you get more and more expertise in sort of a smaller and smaller region of the world. Such that with my friend Joe became literally the world expert in one tiny bit of the brain. And we got to the stage we thought, well, it will be interesting if we could take some of this knowledge, some of these techniques that we've developed, and leave the ivory tower a little bit and talk to people. And this is not a case of sort of educating people outside of science as testing the tools that we've developed to see if these ideas, these theories can work and have value in the real world. So that's why we wanted to talk to people who do marketing, people who try and find out why people do things, to talk to them and see if our tools can help them or can sort of add to what they do. So this, after a few years, it's morphed into sort of 3 different things that we do. One of them is just about understanding neuroscience, and we run these workshops where we talk people through what we know about contemporary neuroscience, how it can be applied, and we have discussions and we workshop their problems. And these workshops, I'll give you a link to them at the end in case they're of interest. They do sort of begin a little bit negatively because there is so much bad stuff out there, like this fact that I have on screen here, that the average person uses 10% of their brain capacity, which you'll hear bandied around all the time. And it's fascinatingly and completely untrue in a very deep and profound sense, but still people seem to believe it. Or that 95% of all decisions are unconscious, or that your lizard brain is the thing that makes decisions when you buy things. There's so much bad neuroscience out there, that we have to spend some of our time being negative and unprogramming some of these things that people talk about all the time. But then, of course, we turn more positively. We talk about what we do now about the brain. We found out in the past 100 years or so. We show some of our new toys like the fMRI, and we try and show how these things can be leveraged to understand problems in the workplace, of understanding consumers or understanding employees. So the workshops is the first wing of what we do. The other thing that happens when we consult with people, we threw open our doors and we said, basically, does anyone interested, do they have a question that we can try and answer as scientists? And we had some very strange approaches. Someone was a professional cuddler and wanted to know what happens when she cuddled people. We had someone ask what happens to the brain when you eat a really nice pie. Lots of quite strange questions. Some of this ends up with what we call neuroscience as marketing. So we'll use our techniques to generate materials that starts a discussion or illustrates a concept. So this video that's playing here is work that we did with a YouTube blogger called M. Ford, who had a site, I don't know what it's called, but she has very sort of bad skin, and she uses makeup, and it's all about being body positive and learning to cope with that. So we did some work in the scanner, brain scanning people, looking at her models with and without their makeup on to try and sort of unpick what it is to perceive someone without that filter, without that tinkering of the image. And we've done other things as well, where we just sort of use these things to illustrate ideas that already is there. That's neuroscience as marketing. But the other thing that we do that I'll talk more about today for you people is what we call neuroscience for marketing, where a company will come to us with a question. They want to find something out. They want to understand their consumers more deeply, either to predict what they want or to tell them this is why what we're selling you has value. So, for example, and I'll talk about this research a little bit later, Audible came to us and said, well, what happens to the brain when you listen to an audiobook? How is that different from watching TV or reading? How can we understand what it is that our product is doing and how people are relating to it? We have people who sell tickets who wanted to know, well, what is our motivation for selling these tickets to people to go and see a play in the West End when they could sit at home? So these are people who came to us with a hypothesis, and we used our tools to try and investigate them. And this really is what I'll be talking about today, because this, in my naive way, is closest to what you would do in terms of market research, trying to answer these questions, trying to get under the hood of why people might or might not engage in some behavior or some purchasing. So I'll be giving you a few case studies of work that we've done, examples of how we can use these tools to gain insight in some way. And I'll talk through this stuff in more detail when we come to it. So the first little case study that I want to talk about is all about using neuroscience to understand collective experience, what happens when we get together as a group. And this, in my pure sort of lab science role, this is the scientific topic that I'm interested in, the sort of blend of social and cognitive psychology, how we make decisions, how those decisions are shaped by the people around us. And of course, we engage in, the interesting thing to us, of course, is people engage in collective behavior all the time. They go out to the cinema, they go out to see things, they shop in shops surrounded by other people. But scientifically, most of our tools are designed for one person. We have these little lab cubicles, or we have scanners that only fit one person. So this is really interesting to us scientifically. Well, how can we understand this sort of social behavior? How can we move our tools outside of the lab? And we got the opportunity to do this in quite a bizarre case. So this on screen here, if you're not familiar, this is Desperado's beer, which is a mixture of Heineken and tequila, and tastes just about as bad as it sounds. And the people who market Desperados, they do this thing every year where they have some sort of event. And I forget the term for this. It's experiential marketing. I'm sure you people know better. It's something like that. They create an event that to them is associated with their brand. And one year what they did was they hired the plane that flies up very high, then drops rapidly, so there's zero gravity. And they filled it with young party-going people, and a DJ as well, and they set it up so that the moment that the gravity disappeared, the beat dropped in this music, and it was the first weightless disco. And that, in some way, they want to associate their brand with that. They do all sorts of crazy things like this every single year. And their intuition, this is where we come in, their intuition is after doing this for a few years, When people engage in these acts of collective experience and these crazy events, they thought it changes your creativity. It has a psychological effect on you. Just through talking to people afterwards, they said they had an idea the next day after having this experience that they've been struggling with for ages. So they wanted to put numbers, they wanted to measure this intuition they had, this hypothesis that something about these collective events engage and increased creativity. And the event that they were doing that they got us involved in was the world's first, I think only, probably, underwater rave. So they went to the world's deepest pool, which is just outside of Venice. And you can see pictures of it here. And they had these special helmets that people wore where you can breathe underwater. So the partygoers were going underwater. Then they had a DJ who apparently was very famous. I'd never heard of her, who played music that gets pumped into the headphones. And there's people swimming around dressed as mermaids and so on. And this was the world's first deepest underwater rave, was the idea. And what they wanted to do is for us to do our science in this environment. And this does not look like my regular scientific environment, right? This is not a boring building in Bloomsbury in a lab. This is a very rich, dynamic environment. But we were able to do good science using just basic experimental techniques. Forget about the crazy situation. So long as you can take your tech in there a little bit, you can find answers to these questions. So our participants were apparently 100 of Europe's top social media influencers, people I'd never heard of. And all we did was just use iPads, these little things that have more computing power than a computer did when I was in grad school. And we put our experiments on these tablets. And all we did was measure creativity with these battery of tests that psychologists have used basically since the 70s. And they tap into creativity in different ways. And just to switch to lecture mode for a second, we think of creativity in two different ways. There's divergent creativity, which is combining stuff in a novel, unexpected way, which is closer to how we typically think of creativity. That's divergent creativity. The other sense of creativity is convergent, and that's coming up with this crazy stuff, but within the rules, right? You can think, let's have a new building and build it full of, make the bricks out of marshmallows, but that won't actually work because the building will collapse. So real creativity is this tension between crazy creative thoughts, but operating within a ruled structure. So we wanted to tap into these two types of creativity in this task. So what we did was set up these experiments on the iPad. We took at random half of those subjects that we tested before they went underwater and half of them after they went underwater. This is our experimental technique. This is our control condition. And we saw how creative they were. So they came out of the water in the experimental condition. They wiped the makeup off. We gave them an iPad and they typed in as many uses they could think of for an empty bottle of Desperados. Standard measure of creativity. You know, you can use it as a weapon. You can blow over the top to make a sound. You can turn it into jewelry if you smash it up. They just wrote down as many as possible. Then they asked them to, what word goes with all three of these? So the first one is divergent. This one is convergent creativity, trying to come up with a solution. And in case you're trying to figure it out, the word is ice, ice cream, ice skate, ice cube. And then the final measure was just to complete this figure, just draw and make that into a bigger picture. And they did it in various different ways. And these are very standard measures that we use in the lab. And all we're doing in this novel really is taking them out of the lab and putting them in the real world to try and get data, which indeed we did. Bizarrely, it seemed to me, we actually found a difference between these two conditions. If people were tested after they came out of the pool as opposed to before, they were able to think of more creative uses for that bottle. They had more creative drawings as decided by graders afterwards. People looked at these drawings and gave them a number, how creative they were. They're doing more creative drawings, more creative thinking. All these measures of divergent creativity increased. They didn't increase on convergent activities. They were not better at solving these word puzzles. And this is sort of what we hypothesize, that those incredible events that you've never experienced before will lead you to be able to combine your ideas in this novel fashion and will increase this convergent but not divergent creativity. So we're able to produce this, and this ended up somewhere in some Desperados marketing scheme, as science has proven that there is a significant increase in creativity as an event of leading the Desperados lifestyle, whatever that means. So we're able to add scientific insight and actual evidence for them to make these claims. So that's my first little story. The second little story that I'm going to tell you about after sipping tea is about how we can use these use various tools in our neuroscience arsenal to try and understand other things about collective experience, specifically things that it's hard to just ask people about. So we started this about 5 years ago, and the basic question that we had was from a ticketing agencies, and they sell tickets across London, and they were struggling, well, not struggling, they wanted to articulate their product better. They wanted to understand what is the value of this collective experience of live theatre. Because to be, play devil's advocate, why would you spend what is the last theatre ticket, like 120 quid to go to an old Victorian theatre where the seats are this big, the stars are that far away you can barely see them, when you could stay at home where you've got a 4K television and a massive sofa and you don't have to pay as much for the snacks? Why should you go out and watch theatre when technology has brought it into our homes so readily? The weird thing is that 5 years ago, when this question was posed to us, we thought, oh yeah, that is quite an interesting question. And other people said, yeah, I don't really know the answer. Then the pandemic hit, and suddenly we were all really conscious of how valuable that collective experience is, because we could only spend time with the 6 people in our bubble. So it's a weird thing. When we began it, it was an intriguing hypothesis, and it was so completely obvious after a couple of years that, yeah, there is something special about that collective experience, and we only really realized that when it was taken away for 2 years. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead of myself. When we first did the experiments, we wanted to somehow capture that, and I have only a very non-scientific words to describe it, that magic of the live experience, that excitement, that feeling that there's a performer in front of you. How do we capture that without tapping people on the shoulder and saying, how are you feeling right now? How are you rating this? Right, we want people to have the experience, but somehow capture it at the same time. And that's why this particular group turned to us as neuroscience to use some of our tools. So the particular tool we use at this point is one that I flagged at the start of the talk here, these physiological sensors. So I'll come back to theatre in a second, but let me just briefly diverge into this other topic. So this is a project that we did with Audible, who wanted to know what happens to the brain on audio books. And again, we thought, that's actually quite an interesting question scientifically. We don't know the difference between how you relate imaginatively to these different stimuli. So we set up an experiment where people either listen to a passage from an audiobook, here it's the Game of Thrones, or they watched a version of that same scene that had been turned into a TV or movie. And as much as we can, we try to keep those things the same duration, the same scene, the same things happening. Of course, they take artistic license when they create these scenes. They can't be identical, but pretty much that's the same bit of that story in Game of Thrones. There was other items, of course, and what you're watching there is the average of about 160 people listening or watching the Game of Thrones. Now, we asked people after they experienced this little bit of the story, we said, how engaging do you find it? Was that sort of imaginary transporting? We asked all these survey questions to say, what was your relationship to that? What was your experience? And what people told us very consistently is that they prefer the HBO version. They prefer the video. They felt more transported. They felt like they were part in the world of Westeros. They said that was the more engaging stimulus of the two. But then we also put a little sensor on them. Not this is an Apple Watch, but a bit like this, a device that measures heart rate and skin conductance and body temperature. They're wearing these physiological sensors. Now, these things you might be more used to thinking of them as measuring as a fitness tool to see how relaxed you are, to see how your heart rate is doing, if you're going couch to 5K and so on. But they can also be used to measure any activity in your autonomic system, even the activity of imagination. So people were wearing these devices, watching the HBO thing or listening to the audiobook. And here are the squiggly lines that are showing us their heart rate, their electrodermal activity, which is basically their sweat, which is a measure of arousal in the body, and their body temperature. And what we found is, although people said that the video was more engaging and exciting and imaginative, their bodies were more engaged, their brains are more engaged by the audiobook. Their heart rates were higher on average. Their heart rates were also lower. There was more variance in their heart rate. Their electrodermal activity was spiking and going up and down as a measure of engagement, emotional and cognitive engagement. Even their body temperatures were a little bit warmer as well. So their brains more engaged by the audiobook, even though that's not what they said. Not suggesting they were lying, but there's just very different ways of engagement. That's the lesson. And what we found is that those audiobooks, although you might not feel you're as engaged, your brain is literally more engaged. It's doing more processing. Why is this? Well, we think the answer is actually very simple, right? If you watch the HBO version of Game of Thrones, they spent an enormous amount of money. They rented half of Malta to film that. They paid for all of these extras. They're doing all the effort to visualize, to imagine Westeros. It's right there in front of you. You just have to consume it. But if you're listening to the audiobook, mentally, you have to put all the effort into imagining it. You've got to generate that thing. And that act of imagination, we're measuring at the wrist. And that sounds quite corny to say we are measuring imagination, but scientifically, that's the only way we can account for these differences, we think. So the point of all that was just another case study in how we can try and give insight in what the brain is doing, how people are behaving when they're experiencing this particular product, but also to motivate the idea that these sensors don't just measure physical activity. They don't just measure fitness. They're also a window into the mind as well. So let's go back to theatre and see how it is that we use them there. So this is about 20 people watching Dreamgirls, the musical on the West End that is probably still playing. And all we can see is the heart rate of each of the people who are sat there. You see there's a big spike in the middle. That's as they go up the stairs. There's a spike at the end as they stand up and applaud and so on. And all I've done here in a very simple way is color this diagram with very, very roughly the levels of heart rate that correspond to mild exercise. So if, according to the NHS, you want to increase your cardiovascular fitness, you've got to raise your heart rate into a certain zone, and that's roughly the zone that I've colored pink here. So what this shows us is that if you go to see a regular theatre show, you spend about half an hour, 40 minutes doing mild exercise. At least your heart is in that zone and it's improving your cardiovascular health. We didn't think this was particularly interesting or surprising scientifically, but it's got an enormous amount of press attention with the headline, going to the theatre is like going to the gym for half an hour, which of course is not actually what we said. But there is a grain of truth that sort of emotional engagement is driving your autonomic system, is driving your heart rate, and will affect your cardiovascular symptoms. As much as going for a brisk walk for 30 minutes, sure, no more than that. But the other side of it is if you are elderly, if you have impaired mobility, well, this is actually a very valid and also enjoyable way to improve your health, perhaps. So there we can just show that there is this benefit that you might not have realized just surveying people, this physiological benefit to this experience. But of course, we can probe a little deeper and say, this is the individual heart rates, but what happened to them as a collective, as a group of people when watching this show? This squiggly line is the average heart rate over the time of the show, having cut out the interval in the middle. And what we see here is peaks and troughs, right? This is not a flat line. What that tells us is that the heart rate isn't random. If it was just going up and down at random, we would have averaged it out too flat, but there are peaks and there are troughs here. What do they correspond to? Well, our understanding, our hypothesis is this is the narrative. This is the story. This is a little diagram of the plot of Dreamgirls. And we have evidence for that because we can compare the live theatre to Dreamgirls, the movie, which is pretty closely matched in terms of what happens. It's moved from about 10 years ago. And if we look at the movie, this is a small number of people seeing the movie, those peaks and troughs line up. Now, why do they line up? Well, because about 2/3 of the way through, I forget the main character, whatever she's called, gets kicked out of the band. And it's very dramatic. And she has this big song that people are standing up and crying about. Then she leaves and she breaks up with her husband. That's the other peak. And finally, they all get back together. Those narrative moments, just the story, that is driving the heart rate of those hundreds of people in the theatre together. And we see it a little bit watching the movie. Why? Because it's the same story. Stuff happens at the same time. So the things about this chart is that, well, those peaks and troughs line up because it's the same story, but also you notice that the movie line is flatter. The peaks are not as high, the troughs are not as low. Why is that? Well, we think there's something about the variance in the heart rate that is, again, telling us something about the engagement that people have. And the reason is that most people it's intuitive that when you're excited, your heart will race. If you're excited or if you're angry, but if your arousal goes up, your heart races. But also when you're very focused on something, your heart rate lowers. We call them heart-stopping moments. When you're really focused, when you're holding your breath because a dramatic thing is happening on stage, you quieten your physiological system, you dampen it down. So that's why we're interested in both these peaks and these troughs as being bigger and farther apart in that live theatre. You have more, those heart-stopping moments are more heart-stopping, the elating ones are more elating. That's what the data seem to be telling us. Oh, and that's if you're watching the movie alone. So what we're trying to do in this research project that we had to stop because then the pandemic hit and we couldn't do any more experiments. What we're trying to understand is it the fact you're on sat in front of a stage and there are real human beings in front of you that are singing and dancing that is engaging? Is it the fact you're around 1,000 other people watching the same thing? Is it that makes it engaging? What exactly is it about this live collective experience that is producing this increase, this particular heart rate signature, and which people are prepared to pay for because of this value, apparently? So we're trying to understand and unpick this in various ways. It's not just the live element of that. We think the live element is important, but we think any collective experience might have this sort of response. So this is data from people, this is work with View Cinema, watching the Aladdin movie in a cinema. And here we have the heart rate, body temperature, and electrodermal activity all together. And again, we can see peaks and troughs, and these correspond to something. If you look about 3/4 of the way through, there's a big peak in that red line, of the green and red lines in heart rate, electrodermal activity. That is where Aladdin gets his first kiss. And as you see, there's a romantic moment amongst cartoon characters. Literally, the audience's hearts start to increase at the same time. So we can measure the heart rate of individuals and see how they vary. But for some findings in the scientific literature, we're also interested in something else that we think gives us a unique insight into understanding the consumer and this when they're having this collective experience. That was abstract, I'm sorry. What we think is important is not just is your heart rate going up or going down and what is your individual heart rate pattern. It's the fact that your heart is changing in synchrony with the people around you. And we have various mathematical tools to put a number on the degree to which your heart rate changes are coordinated, are synchronized with the people around you. We can quantify this. And that physiological synchrony seems to be really important in picking out that enjoyment, that engagement. And this is evidence that we're just starting to gather, that we're putting together right now. But wherever we look, we come across this notion of if we have a similar physiological response, that seems to be predicting engagement. In the last few things, I'm going to try and convince you of some of that. But this is just the data from people in Dreamgirls, the movie, versus the live theatre. And this is a plot of the heart rate coordination that, again, is higher for the live theatre, but is also really peaking exactly at those moments, those key plot moments. Now, just sort of back up, why is it that we're interested in synchrony? Well, this is an emerging field over the past 10, 20 years. Well, for longer than 20 years, we've known that there is behavioral coordination really seems to matter. That's Donald Trump and his press secretary with exactly the same body gestures. In the bottom right, you'll see that's 2 undergraduates in my lab with these motion trackers on, and you can see that I just left them to play with the equipment and press record, but of course they're 20-somethings, so they are flirting with each other. And if you look at how they're sort of swaying in time, about how they nod in time with each other, that similarity, that coordination, their behavior, that relates to affiliation. That is what flirting looks like. And of course, this coordinated behavior we see across the animal kingdom in lots of ways. And in general, we know that this coordinated activity, this similarity in body language, is related to affiliation, to liking other people. What we found out more recently is that this coordination matters under the skin as well. And this is where we think it might give insight to people who do market research, who are trying to understand how people experience things. So we know, for example, that if two people are in love, look at each other in the eye, their heart rates will start to synchronize a little bit. We know that this is work done in a village in Spain by Ivanka Konlikova, a friend of mine, where she went to one of these villages where people walk across the hot coals, a ceremonial thing they do around Easter, I think. And she put her heart rate sensors on people who are walking across the coals and people who are watching them. And she quantified, like we have been doing, the synchrony between their heart rates. And what they found is that they could predict the synchrony between the heart rates based on the familial relationship of the person walking and the person watching. So if that was your son walking across the coals, you had very closely connected heart rates. If that was your brother, slightly less so, your cousin, slightly less so again. Just by capturing the heart rates of people walking across the hot coals, she could reconstitute the whole familial relationship of that village. And we know this sort of physiological activity is very important for teams as well. Teams that exercise in time with each other, they possibly people who do the haka, they're changing their endorphins, they're changing their pain threshold levels, all of these things as a consequence of this coordinated activity. Our hypothesis, what we're trying to investigate, is that all of these things that are in the scientific literature, does that help us understand collective experience? Can we use it to do research on the market for going to the cinema, for going to the theater? So what we did is we took people who had gone to see Aladdin, in this case, that show at the View Cinema at Westfield, and we measured their heart rate synchrony and we quantified it. And as a comparison group, we compared it to people who just sat in a room with each other reading a book for the same amount of time. And what we found was overall heart rate synchrony was higher when people had been in the cinema watching Aladdin, having the same imaginative experience as each other. But also, they felt more connected to each other if they had watched that movie together. If they're reading the books separately, their heart rates weren't well coordinated. If they're watching the movie together, then they did get this coordination between their heart rates. And more interestingly for us, the degree to which people's heart rates were synchronized with each other correlated, predicted the amount they felt socially connected to the people around them. And this is what we've been using to research people's experience of all sorts of different activities. So for example, this was the day before the lockdown hit. Excuse me, I'm getting a warning message. Before the lockdown hit, we took these same devices to the English National Opera. People were watching Carmen, I think, and we measured the heart rate synchrony as well. And we did the standard sort of market research surveys afterwards, asking people to self-report about how captivating they found it, how emotionally engaging, how spiritually uplifting. And we found these really strong correlations between their physiological synchrony with each other and their personal experience of this thing that was on stage. So there's something very revealing, we think, about this physiological synchrony and what it says about people's experience. Maybe something they won't even say themselves, but we can capture it with these tools, we think. So we looked at, we went to the opera. We also, this is again a weird bit of market research. Lad Bible came to me. They make online videos, if you haven't heard of them, and they wanted to make a bit of content to promote the new FIFA video game because it's got very realistic crowd noises. Side note, I think it's the case that those crowd noises from the video games are the thing they used to generate football sounds on TV when there were no such crowds during the pandemic. Anyway, separate point. They wanted to show the power of the crowd and why it was important. So they came to us and said, well, can we figure out which fans are more passionate? If you can measure this social connection between people, can we use it to compare football teams? Which I thought, well, that's a terrible idea because you're going to make half the country really upset. And they said, well, yes, that's the point, because then they'll retweet it because they'll get upset. This is why I'm an academic, not a scientist. I didn't realize this. Anyway, we use the same tools. We put these devices on Man City and Liverpool fans while we were watching the first time they met in the previous season. It was a very exciting match, ended 2-2. And we plotted again the heart rate synchrony. And you can see here, this is during the second half when all the goals were. Each time one of the teams scores, there's a peak in the heart rate synchrony of the supporters because they're jumping up and down, because they're, there we go, the Liverpool people, we can see that. She knocked over the camera at that point. We can see this synchrony between people playing out in their heart rates. So we get a peak whenever your team scores, that's obvious. But what was interesting to us is when the times when the goals were not going in, there was a really distinct difference between the teams. There was more heart rate synchronization between the Liverpool fans than the Man City ones, particularly towards the end, where the synchrony dropped and dropped and dropped for the Man City, but maintained high for the Liverpool fans. Why is this? Well, our hypothesis was those Liverpool fans were more coordinated with each other. They were more bonded. They had more social affiliation. We have independent evidence for this because they also sang more and they sang louder. On all of that activity, singing together, chanting together, that has a causal effect on synchronizing your heart rate and your activity. So we think we can use these tools to tap into that feeling, not just of excitement about the match that's happening, but those feelings of affiliation with the people sat around you in the stadium, or perhaps even sat at home. So this is where we move into sort of more standard market research. Perhaps it's not my field, but our hypothesis was, well, we've got this device that measures heart rate and measures physiological activity. We found in all these different ways that if we show someone something, measure their physiological activity, figure out how synchronized people are, that tells us how engaged they are in that stimulus. We thought that if this is true, well, let's try and test that. So we got people into the lab and we showed them trailers for these movies. This was 2 years ago, I think. We measured their physiological response to that 2-minute trailer, and then we computed, well, how similar is their response, right? We put a number on this physiological synchrony. We then waited for a little bit until we could get global box office takings of each of those movies. And what we found was a correlation between the two. The degree to which people had a synchronized, coordinated physiological response to that 2-minute trailer predicted global box office takings of the movie a year later. So we think that's tapping into something, that coordinated physiological response, separately from asking people, did you like it? Is this a good movie? That didn't predict the global box office takings, but something about that coordinated physiological activity did. So we did this with movie trailers. We did it with several different, oh, I'm going to turn that down. I didn't realize I had the sound of one of the people. So we thought, well, we want to test this idea. We want to see if this is true. So why don't we test it with the world's biggest cultural event, which is the Eurovision Song Contest. So about 3 months ago now, we thought, well, let's try and put this all to the test. Let's see if we can predict the winner of the Eurovision Song Contest. Well, that's not quite true. We didn't try and predict the winner because everyone knew that the winner was going to be Ukraine. My computer is got a spinny thing. Can I just check that people can actually hear me? Hang on.
I could hear you speaking, and we can hear some music in the background, Dan.
1 second, sorry, everything is collapsing here. Let me just go back to this slide a minute. My apologies. Something about the joy of Eurovision broke my computer there. I do apologize. So let me just describe that study rather than show you all the videos. I think they were overloading the system. So our hypothesis was that we have this tool, this physiological measurement that seems to be predicting something about engagement. If that's true, can we show people Eurovision Song Contest entrants? Can we measure their engagements, and can we predict who will win the Eurovision Song Contest? Now, because of various technical limitations, we couldn't show them obviously all 30 of those songs because half of them are not decided until the day before when there are semi-finals. I know a lot about Eurovision rule structure right now. So what we did is we just took a handful of them, 8 of those things that we were sure were going to be in the final competition, and we tried to predict how they would place relative to each other. And we deliberately didn't include UK because we were going to do it on UK people, and we didn't want that confound of nationalistic pride being part of it. And we also didn't include Ukraine because it was completely obvious Ukraine were going to win. They were odds-on favorite for the past 4 months. So if we said, hey, look, we predicted Ukraine wins, we don't get any credit for that. So that wasn't interesting to us. So we picked another 8 of these shows, and we tried to measure how well they succeeded. And we just got people in cubicles, they watched these shows. Again, we measured their physiological responses, and we made our predictions, which I can't show you because it will break the, the display again. But if you go to neurovision.squarespace.com, you can see our predictions, you can see how it panned out, you can look at our results. How did we do? Did we predict the winner? Well, no, because the winner was Ukraine. And how do we do? Well, sort of pretty good. So we got that the top ones would be, we basically successfully divided the songs into sort of 3 categories of those 8. We successfully identified the top few, which was sort of Sweden and Spain. We identified the ones that were going to come in bottom, which was going to be France and Germany and Norway. And that was our correct prediction. Within those sort of groups, we got the order not exactly right. But again, given that we're not asking anything of people, we're just measuring at their risk, the fact that we could predict to any degree at all how well, God, how many is it? 300 million people would then vote, was to us really interesting. So that's one way that we're trying to develop, and that's one thing we're really interested in doing in the future. Can we use these tools to try and predict engagement? So if people have 2 versions of an advert with a different soundtrack on each of them, can we measure the engagement and use our tools to predict which is going to be retweeted, which is going to be liked, which is going to be the more successful advert? Can we use these tools to inform and add data to the sort of creative decisions that might be choosing between different edits of a movie trailer, for example? That's our ideal goal, that we want to try and use these things, because you can ask people, but they don't always have, as of course you guys know, they don't always have the most accurate intuitions about their own beliefs. There's all sorts of interesting psychology about how people may not always give you the accurate response. But if we can get under the hood and measure the physiological response, maybe we can get different predictions, or at least add to the data set of insight that people may have when they're trying to choose between products, choose between edits, choose between different versions of a stimuli that they're making. All right, I'm not going to risk showing you more slides of neurovision in case the computer collapses. So I'm going to skip to my last slide, since we're almost at the end of our 45 minutes here. I hope some of that was intelligible, that the computer didn't collapse and that you heard some of it. If you're interested in any of this, we are very keen, as I say, to work with other people. And we're interested in this because it brings insight to us, right? And indeed our students. So some of the things you saw were master's or undergraduate students who are doing this because they're very excited about these tools and they want to apply them to the world. So it's not empty talk when I say we really seek out these collaborations, not just because it gets us business, because it's a really interesting scientific thing for us to do. So those collaborations typically take 2 forms that we do. We write sometimes just research reports for people. We look at the literature that's out there and we say, this is what psychology will tell you about this topic. We did this for, I don't think I can name them, can I? A company that sells gifts wanted to know, why is it people sometimes give a gift that's not appreciated, sometimes give a gift that is appreciated? Why do we fail to predict people's reactions and they're sometimes disappointed? What's the psychology behind that? Which actually turned out to be really interesting. Bottom line, just give people cash. They much prefer it. Never try and surprise people with a gift. They really don't like it. Anyway, so we just do research reports on these things. And then sometimes, often, as the things I've shown you here, that then turns into novel experiments. Given that's what the literature says, well, can we test that idea? Can we find new evidence that people may respond to that product in this way, will have this experience or this belief when they interact with it? So that's sort of the scientific element of it that we do with various different businesses that were mentioned at the start. And then, again, as I said at the opening, there's these workshops that we do. The next one's coming up in November. We do them in person in London. These are codes that we've negotiated for the ICG people. So there's one version that's 2 days in London, that's sort of all of those 2 days. And then there's another version that, of course, we developed over the pandemic, where you watch the videos by yourself offline, and then 3 times a week we come together and we discuss them, and we do live demonstrations, we workshop ideas about how to apply them, and so on. So those are the interactive bits of training, teaching we do in collaboration with UCL. And we also do these sort of short-paced video courses where you just put all of this lecture content online that you can work through whenever you want. There's no interaction, of course, that one's much cheaper, but you can learn about these ideas through our Podia channel. Well, you've been terribly patient with my technological problems, and I apologize for those. But at this point, are there any questions anyone has about any of that?
Wow, that was so fascinating, Dan. Thank you very much for that. Let me just think. Any questions coming through from anyone? Looks like you've been able to explain it to everyone without leaving any questions. I'm just absolutely amazed that, you know, if anybody had any doubt that science was exciting or could be exciting, then I think you've certainly proved that that it's not dull with underwater parties, etc.
That was a little ridiculous, that one, yeah.
Okay, so we've got a question that's come through. Have you done any work on shopping and web shopping versus in store?
No, that's a really interesting question. We haven't done anything personally, but there are experiments that other people have been doing, and typically what they do is look at sort of the displays, right? So there's lots of eye tracking work. We do eye tracking things as well. I didn't mention it here, but people look at ways in which your visual attention is being controlled and manipulated. So that's another measure we can use of eye tracking to show the decision process, because we can see you looking at that money off button, we can see you looking over here in comparison, and we can draw conclusions about what information led up those discussions. So there's and this whole sort of virtual storefronts that people have built to do experimentally. So looking at the visual attention, how that plays out online versus in person, is an active research area. IKEA does an enormous amount of this to try and figure out how to structure their environment and drag your visual attention around. They an IKEA designer was telling me they deliberately get you slightly lost. That feeling of where is the exit, where are the curtains that you have, that has been engineered so you discover new products. They are trying to slightly disorientate you. That's why you turn several times. Lots of that stuff was based on eye tracking work and other things, trying to understand people's behavior. So it's a really interesting field. I personally haven't done anything yet on that.
Okay, and just another quick question. Well, quick, not necessarily quick. If we were running some research to test different versions of a television or radio campaign, for example, what sort of budget would you have to add in to be able to include some of this sort of testing? To see what the physiological responses are to the different options. How much extra would we have to sell to our client to be able to include something like this? Probably it's like a ball of string, but just, you know, just some sort of idea.
It is a bit ball of stringish, and I'm the science guy, not the business guy, and he'll scream at me if I say the wrong thing at this point, I'm sure. But very, very roughly, we're looking at sort of the numbers of people that you need. You need sort of at least 20, 40, 60, 80. The Eurovision experiment I showed you had 100 people in, but they were trying to discriminate 8 different stimuli. So the key thing is how many different things you're trying to tell the difference between. Is it just this trailer, or are there 14 different versions? And how many are you trying to segment people at all? So you're trying to understand how men versus women or old people versus young people may respond to it. Because each time you ask a different division, have a different comparison, that increases the number of people that you need. But it's sort of the simplest case of, is it this version or this version, you might run sort of 30, 40 people up to sort of 100 or more if you have more complicated questions. In terms of the cost of how much it costs, we're sort of looking at sort of 10K at the bottom end, and then would go up with a degree of complexity. It might be lower than that. It might sort of be more sort of at 5, but it's hard to get a sort of a satisfying answer if you go lower than that, because that means fewer data points for us. So very, very roughly, upwards of sort of 7, 8K, and it can go up to, well, it can keep on going up, of course.
And practically, how would that work? Would that be in a sort of lab or central facility type situation?
Yeah, that's right. So there's various different ways that we're all sort of built around the pandemic, of course. Lots of the work I showed you was live experience. So that's just taking our sensors to Westfield and putting them on people, taking them off after the movie or the show, and so on. So if what you're looking at is part of it is a live experience, we can do that. But if it's a pre-recorded stimuli, if it's an advert, for example, then what we do is we have cubicles and spaces in London on the Bloomsbury campus or elsewhere, and we'll recruit people and bring them in and run them on our premises. So yeah, we can go out into the world, or we can bring people into the lab. It all depends upon what is the type of stimuli you're looking at.
Yeah. Okay. So we've
And
got
then
another
presenters
question.
themselves.
Sorry?
Right, go ahead.
We've got
No,
another
do go ahead. Sorry.
We've got another question come through from Liz. How do you control for external factors? And we all know that correlation does not equate to causation. How do you minimize arriving at misleading conclusions?
Is there a particular study you were asking about in that context? Because the question might change. Well, let me give sort of a broad answer. Yes, of course, we don't want to leap to these sort of causal conclusions. And to be very careful about what we're claiming about, for example, about heart rate synchrony and how much you enjoy that live performance of dream goals. Our hypothesis is not that if you make yourself, if your heart beating in time with someone else's causes you to enjoy a thing more, right? The causality was not from the physiology to the experience. That's not what we're trying to suggest. What we think is happening, and we want to do more experiments, right? We're trying to unpick it and give a causal story. But our best guess at the moment is that your physiological synchrony, your heart rate being in sync with other people, that's because you are breathing in at the same time. That's because you're cheering at the same time. That's because you're laughing at the same time. And all of that activity that you're doing with the people around you is causing your heart rate to synchronize. So we're not making a causal claim from one to the other. All we're saying is literally, as you suggested, that there's a correlation between the heart rate synchrony and the engagement. And regardless of the complicated web of causality, that enables us to use it as a measure. Right, we often say predict as if there's sort of a causal direction, but all we mean is just they're connected, such that if you want to measure how much someone enjoyed that Eurovision thing, you can use their heart rate as an indication of that. And exactly what causes what is a separate question that we're fascinated in, but for the applied question of is this a measure, it doesn't matter as much. But it's a really interesting question. Sorry, I'm giving a far too long answer. That you might think it's not that just forcing people's hearts to synchronize then forces them to enjoy a stimulus and to bond with each other. It's not that simple, but there is something there. There's these really fabulous studies looking at ways to increase social connection and affiliation and to escape the horrible thing of loneliness, which is very damaging psychologically speaking. And one of the best things you can do for loneliness and for depression is to join a choir and sing with people. And honestly, that's not sort of hand waving. If you compare it to taking serotonin or various sort of things your GP will prescribe you, singing with other people has a measurable benefit. And one of the reasons we think particularly choral singing is, well, it puts you in that state because you're singing with them. You have to respire with them at the same time. You have to have that physiological synchrony. And it's not just that that's causing it, but that seems to be part of the picture. In fact, before the pandemic, there were serious moves to allow GPs to prescribe choral singing to their patients because measurably, NICE were behind this, measurably it has as good a benefit as many of the other drugs that we could prescribe you. So that was a very long answer to say that we don't know, we're trying to explore it, but to some degree, it's the connection that we think is interesting that we can exploit, and we can look into the causal story as well.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think that's all the questions that we have, unless anybody's got any last minute questions they want to post. Otherwise, I'd say thank you very much, Dan. That was really fascinating, and certainly your workshops sound like an excellent way of finding out more about the processes and the opportunities that lie here. So unless there's any last minute questions, nothing coming through, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed for your time today, and thank you to everybody else for logging in. Do come back and join us for one of our future webinars coming up. There are a couple more in July that sound really interesting, and I hope to see as many of you as possible at the party. All right,
wonderful.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks for putting up with me on a sweaty day. I do appreciate it. Nice to meet you all.
Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.